Another edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by thelines.com. My name is Eli Herskovich. You can follow me on Twitter at Eli Herskovich by my first and last name. You can follow my co-host, the esteemed MLB baseball betting savant, something like that, whether it's in that order or not.
Getting my butt kicked now.
Yeah, well, you're having a good NFL season, better than I did in week 3. We'll touch on that in a moment. At Moneylines on Twitter, that's with 2 W's. You can follow Mo on Instagram. Mo, is your Instagram handle the same as your Twitter?
I think so.
Okay, I think mine is too. Not completely sure, but you can follow both of us on Instagram as well. You can follow The Lines on Twitter at The Lines US. Before we get started, remember to give the video a thumbs up and ring the bell to get notifications whenever The Lines releases a new sports betting video on any market, including our NFL betting content, just like Beat the Closing Number and the Megapod with Steven, Matt, and Adam. So, Mo, week number 3 didn't go as well for me as week number 1. I think I pretty much pushed in week 2. 1-3 myself. I lost with the Vegas Raiders. We'll touch on Josh McDaniels in a moment. I have some gripes with him. Lost with Carolina and Denver. I apparently did not downgrade that Denver defense enough. I was spot on, though, I think, with my Cleveland, Tennessee handicap. So 5-4 on the year for me individually. We as a show are 8-4, but how did your bets go in week 3 individually?
Really strong week for me, for sure. I was on the other side of you on Steelers. I added the Steelers late. I think I found a +3 -105, so took some Steelers. Listened to my Gridiron Gamble co-host Brett as well and took some Steelers money line. So that was a very good one for me. And I had some Bears live as well once they were down millions. Essentially, I had Bears second half, so that one came home as well.
Wow.
Very good week for me. I got pretty lucky in that one, but I don't know. They should have had multiple big plays. The Chiefs were just like not taking their foot off the gas as early as I expected either. So I don't know. That one was weird, but happy to get the W. I think I had 35.5 or something like that.
Matt Nagy revenge game. I guess not second half betting wise, but he definitely kept his foot on the gas pedal to your point. Although we'll touch on a key injury that involves the Chiefs' next opponent, or focuses on the Chiefs, but pertains to week 4 with Kansas City against and at the New York Jets. So, like I mentioned, strong week for Mo, and he touched on that. Strong week as a show, as we went 3-1. Mo went 2-0. I went 1-1. Hit with the Browns. Thankfully, that was one of my bets from a show standpoint, and we are 8-4, like I touched on the season. So it's been a really good year so far through 3 weeks for Beat the Closing Number. And as we do on Mondays, we'll touch on some of the look-ahead lines and how they differentiate from the week 4 spreads and totals for that matter. And on Thursdays, as we do every Thursday, you'll hear in a few days, 2 to 3 days, depending on when you're watching and listening to this edition of Beat the Closing Number, we'll dive into our best bets. But like I mentioned from the top, the Raiders, and I'm glad you at least cashed on Pittsburgh. I know Brett had a nice bounce-back week after struggling in week 2. You always root for people that you like individually to bounce back, and I'm glad Brett did for sure. Josh McDaniels, man, after the game, doubling down on his decision to kick a field goal down 8 points, this stood out to me. The Vegas Raiders are the only NFL team to attempt a field goal in the last 3 minutes of the fourth quarter, when down by exactly 8 points with less than 5 yards to go for a first down or touchdown since the 2-point conversion was adopted in 1994.
That's amazing.
I know that's a lot of different word vomit being intertwined into that stat, if you want to call it that. And McDaniels, of course, said last night that the Raiders needed multiple possessions to come back. How do you not fire
technically he's right if he means to win the game. They did need multiple possessions.
It's worse than what the Packers did a couple years ago, 2 to 3 years ago in the NFC Championship game, at least from my vantage point. Not that I wouldn't have gotten a bit lucky if the Raiders had come back and gotten the touchdown and the 2-point conversion and won maybe in the final seconds or into overtime against Pittsburgh. But, I mean, the yards per play were about even on both sides. Garoppolo got into a rhythm in the fourth quarter. I thought the Raiders, I mean, I know Kenny Pickett looked good in the first half, kind of went back into a shell into those last, 2 or 3 final possessions for Pittsburgh. I thought the Raiders could have conceivably won that game if Garoppolo had more of a better mindset himself, along with McDaniel's decision-making in that second to last or that last Raiders possession. But Mo, what do you make of McDaniel's comments post-game and also tripling down on what he had to say on Monday even?
I mean, I thought it was embarrassing, obviously, but overall, I thought the game went pretty similarly to how I kind of expected it to go. I was a little bit surprised the Raiders were able to get as much pressure on Kenny Pickett as they did defensively. I would say I would be a little bit concerned for the Steelers' offense, to be honest, at this point. I know they really struggled the first few weeks. I thought they would maybe have a better bounce back here against the Raiders, considering how strong the opposition was. They had an incredibly difficult first 2 weeks in terms of just who they played defensively. But just not being able to find much breathing room against a Raiders defense that I think is pretty bad. I'm pretty concerned about that, to be honest with you.
The one thing I will note, and this always doesn't carry over week to week in terms of missed turnover opportunities or turnover luck, positive turnover luck in this sense for the Steelers, but Marcus Peters dropping that interception that could have easily gone for a pick six.
There was a couple on the outside that I thought were pretty poor by Pickett.
Yeah, and that he played better than I expected, even against, like you said, that bad of a Raiders defense, with the exception of maybe Mason Crosby up front, who, to your point...
Mason Crosby. That would be Max, but keep going.
Max Crosby. I'm thinking of the former Packers kicker. I'm thinking of Green Bay. I had Green Bay in my head because of that fourth down conversion or the fourth down play that should have been the Raiders going for 2 and not the Raiders kicking a field goal and comparing it to the NFC Championship game. My apologies, Mo. I didn't know I wasn't allowed to make a mistake, as I
just
am
letting
under
you know.
the weather. I appreciate the call out when needed. So I'm glad I got that rant out there towards Josh McDaniels, not to be confused with Mike McDaniel, who exceeded expectations and then some for the Miami Dolphins offense. Did not take the foot off the gas pedal, maybe with the exception of trying to go for the scoring record in the final couple possessions for the Dolphins. But we have 4 games to hit on in terms of significant or key line movement around the key number. Starting off with Lions-Packers, then we'll touch back with the Dolphins against the Bills, a huge AFC East matchup. Patriots and Cowboys and Chiefs and Jets, like I mentioned. Patrick Mahomes likely playing in week 4. I wouldn't expect otherwise, but that ankle injury definitely something to note, as we'll touch on in the final game here on Beat the Closing Number. But Mo, kicking it off with Lions at Packers. Green Bay was a point and a half. They were favored by just that on the look-ahead line, looking back at last week. Now, Detroit is favored by 1.5, 2 points, as pretty much across the board, consensus favorite, to say the least, against Green Bay here in a big NFC North matchup with both teams sitting with a 2-1 outright record. I know this line is right around a dead number, so you might say, well, even though this line is flip-flopped, what does the line movement necessarily mean, and how much significance does it hold? But you have to look back at the Packers' last game. The Saints were a 2-point road dog before the line flipped or maybe got closer to a pick'em as the game got closer to kickoff on Sunday, early Sunday afternoon. And that number, if you got the Saints earlier in the week, which I know our boss, Brett Colson-Digg, paid big-time dividends as the Saints lost by a point. So just because the line is around a dead number doesn't mean that it doesn't hold any sort of significance. Detroit outgained the Falcons in week 3, 5.8 to 2.6 yards per play. Jared Goff, 7.4 yards per pass attempt. Desmond Ridder with just 3.1 yards per attempt, which is not anything new if you've watched the Falcons offense over the first 3 weeks of the season. And outside of Matt Nelson for the Lions on their offensive line, Detroit has an elite run blocking grade on each of their run blockers up front over the first 3 weeks. And the Packers' run defense, Kenny Clark and Devontae Wyatt have, while they are great in terms of getting after the pass rusher, they do not grade well in terms of stopping the run. So just something to keep in mind there. And Detroit has performed above average in the run game over the first 3 weeks in terms of, or below average, I should say, in terms of EPA per carry and success rate on the ground. But a potential get-right spot here against a Joe Barry run defense that has traditionally struggled against the run, and that is no different than how they've performed over the first 3 weeks. So how are you evaluating Lions and Packers in week 4, Mo?
I definitely think there's a chance we could see Green Bay closing as short favorites here. And I can't see the line moving the other way. Like you said, it's already moved that way from the look-ahead number. So I would be pretty surprised if Detroit approached -3 here. I think a big part of the move against the Packers last week was just nothing positive came out on the injury report for them. So I guess we'll see what happens there. But yeah, I'm assuming, dude, is there a more bizarre situation than what David Bakhtiari is doing? Like he just doesn't play unless he's on grass, or what's going on there? I guess he's going to play since they're going home. But yeah, this is really odd. So I guess he's going to come back.
But that's been stagnant from the last, at least last season, if not 2 seasons for Bakhtiari.
Yeah, this is just a really bizarre situation, but he's coming back home, so I guess he's going to play. Jair Alexander, a surprise miss in terms of being on the field. I don't think anybody expected that. And then obviously Aaron Jones and Christian Watson remaining out. So I'm assuming they're going to get healthier. So that could maybe move the needle in favor of the Packers here. At the same time, I'm concerned about their sustainability on offense. I think a lot of people have pointed out, while a lot of the grading and EPA numbers and stuff like that are a fan of what Jordan Love's been doing, the success rate has been poor, like really poor. So over-reliance on big plays, something I've pointed out in the past with the Seahawks that I think ended up holding true when they had Russell Wilson. Just not something you can build an NFL offense on, because you just so often need to be moving the sticks more consistently. That's kind of why you see a game like where the Packers have 0 points and then they score 18 in the fourth, right? Like that doesn't happen if you're moving the sticks on a consistent basis. So, yeah, I'm a little worried about that, but man, they do have a really good matchup here against the Lions secondary that I don't think either one of us respects all that much. I knew that it was a good matchup against the Falcons. That's why I bet them here. But the Packers are actually going to try to get after them through the air, and I'm worried about the Lions' defense against anybody that tries to get after them through the air.
And to your point about Jordan Love, if he is able to have more than just a fourth quarter of success, completion percentage over expected ranks number 33 among 34 qualified quarterbacks through 3 weeks. So you look at EPA plus completion percentage over expected, CPOE composite, and he ranks above average among qualified quarterbacks, behind Lamar Jackson even. But then you look at just CPOE, and he ranks number 33 in the league. So it's a great point to keep in mind outside of explosive plays, because that kind of condenses what the quarterback does in terms of accuracy and refines it even more than just completion percentage, your generic completion percentage that you may look at from a traditional sense. One other thing to keep in mind, too, if Aaron Jones isn't good to go for Green Bay, A.J. Dillon down to a minus 1.26 rush yards over expectation this season. And when you think about below average and then some in terms of production, just like Jordan Love, that number is only better than Cam Akers, Dalvin Cook, Rashad White, and Jamal Williams. So, Packers' offensive efficiency has not been good individually when you look at quarterback performance and without one of the most explosive running backs in the league in Aaron Jones.
Yeah, I mean, I would never expect anything positive to happen when A.J. Dillon gets the ball, generally. So having Aaron Jones in there, who's actually a difference maker, is one of the few situations where I would actually credit something positive and meaningful when there's a running back present.
And I know you kind of lean towards the Packers initially, but if the Lions are able to maintain that positive game script, like I mentioned with their elite offensive line, even though EPA per carry and rushing success rate might not truly showcase just how good they are up front on paper through the first 3 weeks, I do think they could have their way with this Packers defensive front. But not even a lean for me initially, especially with this spread being at a dead number and probably not going up towards Detroit -3 like you mentioned, and especially all the way towards Packers at a field goal or even near that as the week moves along, even if they get more of a positive injury report over the next couple days. Another huge game when it comes to divisional matchups, Mo, Miami at Buffalo. And this was sitting at Bills -3.5 on the look ahead, and it has dipped below the key number of 3, albeit a juiced Bills -2.5. And you may be able to find a flat Bills -3, depending on when you're watching or listening to this edition of Beat the Closing Number. As we mentioned with that Dolphins offense, or at least teased it from the get-go, Miami put up the most single game points in an NFL game since 1966 with a 70-burger against that disgusting Broncos defense. And I didn't downgrade Denver's secondary enough. Patrick Surtain, where were you on the field yesterday? Although you could also correlate that to Vance Joseph having no idea what he was doing with Surtain, especially on that first Tyreek Hill touchdown. I don't know what the hell was going on in that Broncos secondary on that possession. But I digress. Miami with a 61.1% offensive success rate in week number 3, which is unheard of. Tyreek Hill, A-Chan, I think is how he wants to have his last name pronounced moving forward, and Mostert combining for 532 total yards of offense between those 3 skill position players. Just absurd. The Bills defense leading Buffalo to that blowout victory in D.C. yesterday. Looking on the flip side of this Bills-Dolphins matchup, Sam Howell with just 3.3 yards per attempt. And looking at that Bills defense zoning in on what they were able to do against Howell up front, 27 of 39 dropbacks Sam Howell was pressured on. So 69.2% of Howell's dropbacks, he felt pressure, and that was the second highest pressure rate in a game in the next-gen stats era. 7 different Bills defenders generating 4+ pressures at Oliver with 7 of them. And the Bills defense is actually ahead of the Cleveland Browns defense in terms of EPA per play allowed. The Browns are ahead of Buffalo when it comes to opponent success rate, but that
I'd
should
say
stand
so
out.
since they're pretty much off the charts there.
Right, but that should stand out in terms of what the Bills have done on defense. And maybe I upgraded Washington a bit too much, but Bills had their way on that side of the ball against a pretty successful Sam Howell and Eric Bieniemy-led Commanders offense over the first couple of weeks. Granted, it was against Arizona and Denver. But how are you looking at Miami and Buffalo on paper 6-7 days ahead of that matchup, Mo?
Well, unfortunately, how I'm looking at it is I'm kicking myself for not betting the Dolphins. When I wrote the look-ahead article, I thought the +3.5 opener was pretty bad. I thought it was too high by quite a bit, and at least a half, but it's obviously the biggest half point there is. Like, I'm really annoyed that I didn't fire on Dolphins, but I let myself imagine that, well, what if Denver does make this a game like all the sharp people think, and then I might get a better number on. No, not getting a better number, unfortunately. So,
are you calling me sharp? I'll take that as a
all
compliment.
all the people that are the influencers,
know.
whatever you want to call it, they all believed in the Broncos. I didn't, and I should have just trusted myself there. That 3.5 was going to be the best number I was going to see. I'm obviously very excited for this game, genuinely curious which way this goes. I could see a Bills -1 being in play. I could see Bills going back to -3 here, honestly. I would not surprise me either way.
Even after, I would lean more towards the latter. And not that there aren't head fakes in terms of line movement on a week-to-week basis early on when you look at the market, but the fact that there's already juice when there wasn't last night, and again, that very well could be a head fake, but I think this gets closer to 3. I may end up betting the Bills here. You don't typically see this, and this goes to just how bad that Broncos defense is, and you can't even say with Justin Simmons in there that it would have been any different, although neither of those safeties had a ton of experience in the Broncos secondary, but Vance Joseph is way in over his head. Watching that game, man, especially as a Broncos bettor, I'm sitting there and thinking the success rate, at least looking at it when I was on RBDSM or whatever the website is called specifically, the efficiency has to stop, right? You can't be this efficient on an every down basis and an every possession basis. And granted, the Broncos got that 4th down stop when they were down by, I think, 21-10, I want to say. And then they didn't get any points out of that possession in plus territory. That was probably their one shot of making that a game, where with 4 minutes or so left in the first half, I was thinking, okay, Broncos get on the board with a touchdown here. You're down by 4 points. And not to say that possession would have flipped the game, because as we saw in the second half, there was no saving that Broncos defense, especially with how quickly Tua was getting the ball out of his hands. And that also kind of plays towards the Week 4 matchup. As good as the Bills have, and as dominant as their pressure was against Sam Howell, how effective will their pressure be in Week 4 when you're talking about a quarterback that gets the ball out of his hand at a much faster rate? So it's going to be very interesting to handicap as the week moves along, but I wouldn't put it out of my realm to back the Bills under a field goal here, and maybe even at maybe a flat -3. We'll see. But are you pretty much saying you're going to stay away from this matchup?
I would think so. I have some matchup leans that would tell me that I think I should like the Bills a little bit here. I like that they have a pair of elite safeties. I think that might be pretty big, trying to limit some big plays.
Just a little.
Yeah, just even if you're getting beat deep a little bit, or even if like you're getting beat down the field, maybe it's limited to a 20-yard play instead of a 50-yard play, you know?
Right.
Like
maybe you can actually tackle Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
Instead of leaving him with 10 to 15 yards of space.
Yeah, like even if he catches the ball, at least tackle him and make the Dolphins keep executing. I also like the Bills wide receivers a lot in this spot. Man, Eli Apple and Xavier Howard, I mean, that I just don't think they are going to have too much success, honestly, covering the Bills wide receivers. I think they're going to need to win up front probably. And, you know, I think the Bills could win up front on the other end too, to be honest. Their pass rush has been very good so far. They're, I think, in the middle of the pack coming into last week in pressure rate, and they're just not blitzing at all. They were literally bottom of the table in blitz rate. So maybe just keep stuff in front of them here and get into his face a little bit. The Dolphins only scored 24 points against the only legitimate defense they faced. Now, you know, I know that maybe the stats say they should have scored a bit more than that, but I still have questions about this offensive line versus a real pass rush, so I'm excited to see how that goes. I kind of think we should love the under here, to be honest. Both of these teams have had some success slowing each other down at times in some of these recent meetings, so I don't know. The number is massive, man. I think it was 54.5 when I looked at it this morning.
Yeah, looking at the totals here, especially when it comes to Caesars Sportsbook, 54 at Caesars, 53.5 pretty much everywhere else. So if you want to get the best of the number and grab that 54 over at Caesars Sportsbook, as long as you're 21 years older, of course, older in a state where it's legal, and you have Caesars Sportsbook, you could sign up with Caesars Online Sportsbook and bet and use the bonus code, the lines 1000, while creating your first account, of course, and you'll get up to $1,000 back as a bonus bet if your first bet loses. Terms and conditions, as always, apply. More details over at thelines.com. And kind of backing up your point about that Dolphins secondary, which will once again be without Jalen Ramsey, and also backing up both of our points to how good that Bills pass rush was that doesn't blitz a lot, which you definitely hit on. No Von Miller yet. I mean, this is a really underrated defensive front, especially when it comes to production. And maybe that also, we don't want to, just as much as we don't want to say this Miami Dolphins offense is going to be putting up 70 points every week, the Bills aren't going to be generating the kind of pressure rate they did, 69.2% pressure.
I think 40% for context is considered very high. So,
yeah. So Miami's not going to be putting up absurd numbers. The Bills aren't going to be generating that kind of a pass rush every single week. But the Dolphins secondary is still going to be without Jalen Ramsey, and they rank through 3 weeks number 25 in dropback success rate. Broncos offense, mind you, had at least one significant turnover when the game was still kind of in reach, down 18 points. Or at least in terms of the point spread, Courtland Sutton with that fumble late in the first half. So Broncos were still able to move the ball efficiently when the game was still, or at least when the point spread was still not defined. And I know I'm still coming at that as maybe an optimistic Broncos point spread backer in the first half. But listen, that's how you have to take things into context. You see, if you didn't watch the game, you see 70 points, you see a 61.1% offensive success rate, and you say, how can this Dolphins offense be slowed down? Well, if they face an above-average pass rush and a pretty good secondary, at least when it comes to the safeties, which you highlighted. So I like your underlook. I also think I may be on the Bills, but we have 2 to 3 days before we hammer down our bets. On to the third game that we're going to discuss, Mo. Patriots at Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys were 7.5-point favorites on the look-ahead line. Now it's 7 pretty much across the board with a juiced +7 in New England's direction. And that has, of course, a lot to do with Dallas losing outright at Arizona. 13-point favorites they closed at pretty much at every sports book. The Cardinals were +500 on the money line. So congratulations to those of you who had the kahunas to bet on the Arizona Cardinals with arguably the biggest upset of the NFL season thus far. Arizona outgaining Dallas 7.5 to 5.5 in terms of yards per play. And New England, on the flip side of things, just barely took care of business on the scoreboard at the Jets, 15-10. Zach Wilson having a couple chances to come back in that game. But they did outgain the Jets when it came to yards per play pretty comfortably, 5.2 to 2.8. And when you look at the total in that game, also something to keep in mind when it comes to this game in week number 4, the lowest total on the board was Jets and Pats at 35.5, and they still went comfortably under the total by a full 10 points, combining for 25. So is this one of those games, Mo, that you maybe look at the Cowboys and not throw it under the table and say, well, Cowboys lost Trevon Diggs midway through the week in preparation, and maybe that went into their mindset and just negatively affected them going into the week 3 matchup against the Cardinals? Or do you have a lot of concerns with Dallas ahead of this week 4 home matchup against New England?
I think both, to be honest. I definitely saw that Cardinals game as like a super flat spot just because, 2-0 facing the consensus bottom team in the league on the road, and you just had a key player tear ACL. I figured maybe they would come out a little bit flat in that spot. Definitely never, ever imagined they would lose or even come close to losing, to be honest. But I'm still, I'm pretty baffled by this line, I got to admit. So like you said, we're looking at a 7.5 opener. And then Cowboys, that's pre-torn ACL for a top 10 corner or whatever you want to call Trevon Diggs. Obviously, he's a good player. So 7.5 before that, and before they completely no-show basically against the Cardinals, and the line reopens at 7. I thought that's really weird, especially when the Patriots did what they did, which, like you said, the scoreboard doesn't really tell the whole tale, to be honest. They dominated the Jets more than the stats would tell you. Plus 2.4 yards per play, like you mentioned, and plus 180 total yards. They simply just kept driving to the 40 or the 35 and fizzling out in long field goal range. Missed at least one kick, I believe, and then made a couple more. The Patriots, I know they're off to a rough start on the ground so far, but they faced good defenses, especially up front, for sure. Even if I have some questions about the Eagles secondary, they're obviously very strong up front. Same thing for the Jets. And I know EPA and stuff is looking ugly for them on the ground, but I think they should be able to run the ball here. I mean, Arizona trucked Dallas on the ground. I was stunned by this. 220 yards on 30 attempts. I know some of it was Josh Dobbs, a couple long scrambles, but dude, they were still getting plenty of yards on really normal lineup and run the ball forward plays. So Dallas obviously also has played 2 horrible offenses, and then whatever you want to call Arizona, maybe they're halfway decent. I don't know. They're playing halfway decent, certainly. But yeah, I mean, look at the schedule they've played, man. The Patriots are not a horrible offense. Not with Bill O'Brien. They've been okay, I think, so far, and I just don't think this line should be 7. And I am going to be very irritated if this gets down to 6.5 before I am able to pounce on what I think is just a bad number here for the Patriots. I don't think they should be getting a touchdown here.
A couple counters, and not that I'm betting or looking to bet Dallas, but 1 for 5 in the red zone against Arizona, which, not to say that may not translate on a week-to-week basis, but isn't necessarily indicative of future results for sure, especially when you think about how successful and how efficient the Cowboys were on the ground yesterday. Tony Pollard was the example of that, obviously putting up over 120 yards on the ground and also over 100 yards in penalties. So not that I want to chalk this up to the Cowboys maybe underlooking the Cardinals and just having one of those weeks where, especially when you suffer a significant injury like that, how it affects you moving forward. But I do kind of want to throw that result under the rug and maybe just watch what happens in this Patriots-Cowboys game. So I'm not saying you're in the wrong by looking to bet New England, especially if the Patriots are able to have success on the ground and if those concerns do carry over for the Cowboys defense. Also to keep in mind for Dallas in the secondary, I think safety play has been a bit concerning because Deron Bland is a pretty solid fill-in for what it's worth, with Trevon Diggs out for the rest of the season. But J-Ron Kearse has underperformed at least what he did last year. I'm pretty sure he was a Pro Bowl safety last year, if not one of the better safeties across the NFL. So his production at that spot is a little bit concerning for me. But I think the Week 4 matchup between New England and Dallas is maybe just a wait and see and just watch what happens kind of game for me, rather than trying to take a position on it like you are, Mo. But on to the fourth and final game, your Kansas City Chiefs at the New York Jets. The Chiefs have gone from 7-point road favorites, and they were actually as low as -6 on the look-ahead line, out to 9.5. So favored just below the key number of 10, if you want to call it that. And should I go as far as saying your favorite pop artist, Taylor Swift?
I'm not sure if I have a favorite pop artist or a least favorite pop artist.
But it is Travis Kelce's girlfriend. So.
Yeah, she's good in my book for now then.
So, Mo, how are you gauging Chiefs and Jets?
Well, this one is obviously disappointing that we're once again not getting to see Patrick Mahomes versus Aaron Rodgers for the fourth time or something, whatever it is. I tried telling people before the season, watch out for this Chiefs defense. 5th in EPA per play so far, and just completely embarrassed the Bears. I think we just saw what a horrible offense looks like against this Chiefs defense. The Jets have a horrible offense, so I'm very concerned if I'm looking at it from a Jets perspective, what they can do against what I think is a very much legit KC defense. A bad quarterback and a negative script versus these guys. I mean, unlike Justin Fields, at least he's at home. But, man, is home even good in this spot? Like, home could be, the Boo Birds are coming out after the first couple 3-and-outs in this one. Zach Wilson's mental state is already a serious question for me, the way he plays the game right now. So, I don't know, man. This feels like it should be a very workmanlike 27-10 Chiefs W. But on the other hand, we saw what happened in that Bears game. If the Chiefs get out to a big lead, if a bad quarterback is in a negative script, we could see some turnovers. We could see some short fields. We could see some easy Kansas City scores. So, I kind of think the Chiefs should win this by double digits, but the Jets still have a very good defense at home. So, I would lean to the Chiefs in this spot, just because of the fact that this could be a compounding situation when we see Zach Wilson. I mean, dude, he can barely get a first down against these solid defenses he's playing. Like, I know that he had some success last year and was able to, win a couple games and move the ball, but that was not against defenses like Chiefs, Dallas, these teams that the Jets have been playing. It's been a rough schedule early on for them, obviously.
And looking back at Kansas City and that Bears game yesterday, holding the Bears in, like you said, just that situation in Chicago, if the Broncos is bad, then the Bears organization is completely inept. But 6.1 to 4.0 in terms of yards per play, Justin Fields' decision-making continues to be a concern. But my biggest takeaway, like you said, just about Kansas City's defense moving forward, and I wrote this up in our newsletter last week, which you can subscribe to by entering one of our contests over at play.thelines.com, pretty much giving a Amazon gift card away on a daily basis. But Kansas City's defense, if not top 10, or if not top 5, then for sure in the top 10 overall this year. And Trent McDuffie, the number 1 graded cornerback per PFF, which is something that you may not be able to or may not want to take away as the Bible when it comes to individual player grades, but it translates to what Kansas City is doing overall when you look at EPA per play allowed through the air and success rate. And he is definitely taking that jump into the upper echelon cornerbacks on a week-to-week basis. And also just what Kansas City has done overall in that secondary. You called it from pretty much the get-go that Kansas City is the upside of a top 5 defense. So Zach Wilson going up against Kansas City's defense is certainly a concern. We'll see how Patrick Mahomes and that ankle injury fares over the course of the week. Andy Reid downplayed it on Monday, so you wouldn't expect much of a negative notion when it comes to his injury status, especially when it comes to him actually playing in this game. But we'll see when you look at his mobility against a very good Gents front 7 and Quinnen Williams and how he was able to get a ton of pressure against Mac Jones. Doesn't necessarily bode well for the Jets up front against an actual explosive passing offense in comparison to what New England brings to the table. But New England's offense against the Bears defense and what they were able to do and just move down the field at will isn't necessarily and won't necessarily translate to this Sunday night football game, especially if that ankle hinders Mahomes' efficiency at all. It didn't in the AFC, or the Super Bowl, I should say, when he was dealing with that ankle injury. We'll see if it does on Sunday night football. But any closing thoughts for you, Mo, outside of the total for me in this game? It was 45 on the look ahead. Now it's down to 43, 42 and a half. So we've seen a bit of an adjustment, but just because of how inefficient Zach Wilson has been, maybe that plays towards an under on top of Mahomes' injury. Any sort of lean for you in the total betting market?
I guess a little bit to a live over if the Chiefs get a lead early on, is kind of how I would look for this one. Not too much in the pregame, but yeah, I would support any notion that Trent McDuffie is going to be a great cornerback. I loved him from the minute I saw him, basically, in red. So I completely buy into. I thought he was an above-average player last year. So as a rookie cornerback at a position where they're usually getting their butts kicked, I would expect great things from him. I said all last year I thought he was going to be a future star, maybe a future superstar, if a cornerback can be such a thing. So, yeah, very, very excited for his career. And George Karlaftis looking a bit better this year as well, I think. So, just an overall strong Kansas City defense. And, man, as bad as Justin Fields is, at least he's scrambling and taking some shots downfield. It is really ugly what Zach Wilson is putting out there. I mean, that fourth and 10, he threw to a covered check down for 1 yard. I mean, like, Kirk Cousins would be blushing at that one. So, yeah, it's really bad for the Jets offense right now. As bad as it gets, to be honest.
I like the comparison there. Also, look at a Kansas City secondary for one more note and nugget. L'Jarius Sneed, I wanted to bring this up on last week's podcast, but we didn't have time, or maybe it didn't slot in. Well, he held Calvin Ridley to just 2 catches for 32 yards, and they pretty much pulled McDuffie off. If McDuffie wasn't on or was on Ridley for just a few snaps, if not, or if anything last week, then Sneed was pretty much on him for the entire game. And to have those two as your 1 and 2, or number 1 and number 2 cornerback is pretty incredible, and speaks to how good this Kansas City defense has been so far as it relates to the Jags' offensive production, although Jacksonville looked pretty putrid against Houston. But Ridley is certainly an upper echelon number 2 receiver in this league, if not a bona fide number 1. So what they were able to do against him in week 2, and the fact that McDuffie rates so highly across a bunch of different metrics, if you don't want to consider PFF to be one of them, bodes well for Kansas City's defense, to say the least, moving forward. But that's going to do it for this edition of Beat the Closing Number, presented by thelines.com. You can follow Moneylines on Twitter at Moneylines with 2 W's. You can follow me on Twitter at Eli Herskovich. Thanks, as always, to our producer, Rich Ryan, for helping us out, especially with my foggy, sick brain and how I've operated today. So thank you, as always, to Rich, and thanks to Mo for putting up with me here on this Monday. And thank you for watching and listening to another edition of Beat the Closing Number. So long, everybody.